Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping back, way back to the early 1700s in North America. We're going to be looking at Queen Anne's War.
That's right, 1702 to 1713.
And yeah, some folks might know it as the North American part of the War, the Spanish Succession over in Europe. But it really wasn't just some small sideshow over here, was it? We're aiming to unpack how this conflict really fundamentally changed things on the continent and kind of lit the fuse for struggles that went on for years.
Oh, absolutely. And we've pulled together some, well, I think some pretty compelling sources for this deep dive. We've got articles from HistoryNet, Wikipedia for the general framework.
Okay.
We've also got a transcript from a talk by Michael G. Laramie from the U.S. Army Museum, which gives some great military perspective.
Oh, interesting.
And importantly, we've looked at info from the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. That gives us some really vital perspectives, especially around things like the Treaty of Portsmouth later on.
That variety is key. So our plan today is to really get a handle on the events, who was involved, and maybe most importantly, why this war still matters, why it casts such a long shadow.
Exactly.
And maybe one thing to flag right at the start. This war, Queen Anne's War, it really created this kind of colonial Cold War.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, between Great Britain, which formed in 1707,
Right.
and France here in North America. It wasn't like nonstop fighting afterwards, but definitely a period of intense, simmering rivalry.
Constant maneuvering for position, really.
So let's dig in. How did this North American front of a global European war actually begin?
Well, you really have to look across the Atlantic, like you said, to the War of the Spanish Succession. It kicked off when the Spanish King Charles II died back in 1701 without a clear heir.
The classic succession crisis.
Exactly. And it threw all the major European powers into, well, a scramble. And that ultimately led to England declaring war on Spain and France in May 1702. Now, the fascinating part is that initially, both England and France actually hoped they could keep their colonies over here neutral. They even tried to hash out some kind of agreement.
Really? Why didn't that work? I mean, it seems logical to keep the fighting contained over there.
It does seem logical, but the situation on the ground here was already pretty tense. The English and French colonists, they already had this long history of friction.
Right.
A lot of it came down to disputes over borders. Where does New France end and New England begin, and who really controlled the frontier areas?
So existing grudges.
Definitely. You had the English colonies stretching all the way from Carolina up to Massachusetts Bay, plus settlements in Newfoundland and Hudson Bay.
Okay.
And these were often bumping right up against French territories in New France, like Acadia. So there were already competing land claims, little clashes happening. It was like dry tinder, really.
And the European War was just the match.
Precisely.
Well.
Any bigger conflict was bound to spill over.
So who are the main players squaring off here in North America?
Okay, so you had France, New France, and their ally Spain on one side.
Right.
Their main opponent was England, which, like we said, became Great Britain in 1707 when it joined with Scotland. And this is crucial. Both sides relied heavily, really heavily, on alliances with various indigenous nations.
Okay, who were the key allies for the French?
Well, a major alliance for the French was with the Wabanaki Confederacy. This wasn't just one group, but a union of 5 nations. The Abenakis, Malisets, Micmac, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy.
Right.
They had their own long-standing territorial issues, especially with the New England colonies pushing eastward, and they generally sided with the French, particularly up in Acadia, that's roughly modern-day Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, parts of Maine.
And the English side. Who are their main indigenous allies?
Well, with the Iroquois Confederacy, it was a bit more complicated. The English had been trying since the late 1600s, really, to pull them back into conflict against the French.
Through things like the Covenant Chain.
Exactly, that series of agreements. But the French governor Frontenac had actually done a pretty good job undermining that relationship. By 1701, the Iroquois declared they'd stay neutral in any future Anglo-French wars. That was the Grand Settlement.
So neutrality was the official policy.
Official policy, yes. But you had internal divisions, within the Confederacy, and the English kept up the diplomatic pressure. So some Iroquois groups were definitely leaning towards the English or getting drawn in. In fact, eventually, 4 out of the 5 Iroquois nations actually backed away from neutrality. But, and this is fascinating, they apparently also warned the French about possible English moves.
Wow, playing both sides. Or trying to manage the situation.
It seems like a complex balancing act, yeah, trying to protect their own interests caught between these two big European powers.
Makes sense. You also mentioned this Southern theater. Who was involved down there?
Yeah, down south, the alliances looked a bit different. The French allied with groups like the Choctaw, some Chickasaw groups, the Natchez. The English were allied with the Muskogee, who we often call the Creek, other Chickasaw groups, and the Yamasee.
Similar dynamics, though.
Yeah.
Based on trade and existing power structures?
Very similar, yes. Rooted in local trade, regional rivalries, all playing into these larger imperial conflicts.
Okay, so we've got this complex web of alliances across the continent. What did the actual fighting look like? Was it like the big battles in Europe?
Not usually, no. The military tech in the colonies just wasn't as developed. You didn't have many of those massive stone forts, maybe aside from places like St. Augustine, Boston, Quebec City, St. John's in Newfoundland.
So mostly smaller defenses.
Yeah, mostly wooden palisades, sometimes just fortified houses. These limitations really shaped how the war was fought.
Okay. And weaponry, what were they using?
Standard issue for Europeans and colonists was the smoothbore musket. But, limited range, not very accurate. Some colonists might still have pikes. Indigenous warriors often used tomahawks and blows, maybe alongside muskets they'd gotten through trade. And artillery, well, expertise with cannons was pretty limited in the colonies, too.
So fewer big set-piece battles, more raids and skirmishes.
Exactly. That lack of heavy firepower kind of dictated the tactics.
And who made up the fighting forces? Was it all local militias?
That's actually a key difference.
Yeah.
The English colonies mostly relied on their militias, basically part-time citizen soldiers. They didn't have a large number of regular British army troops stationed there, generally speaking.
Right.
The French, though, they had militias too, but they also had a professional standing force, the Troupes de la Marine.
Ah, the Marines.
Right. These were trained officers and soldiers sent over from France. They provided a more consistent and experienced military corps for New France.
And the Spanish in Florida.
A smaller contingent of regular Spanish soldiers, generally. And their policy was often not to arm the local indigenous groups as much as the English or French did.
Interesting difference. Okay, let's zoom in on that Southern theater you mentioned.
Yeah.
What were the main things that happened down there?
Well, the action really heated up in 1702. The governor of Carolina, James Moore, launched this big attack on St. Augustine in Spanish Florida. He was going after the Castillo de San Marcos, that big stone fort.
And how did that go?
Ultimately, it failed. The Castillo was too strong. But what followed was this pattern of retaliatory raids, skirmishes back and forth between Florida and Carolina. The English also clashed with the French, based out of Mobile in what's now Alabama.
Did the borders change much down there because of the war?
Not really significant territorial changes in the South directly from Queen Anne's War, but the impact was huge, especially for the indigenous population in Florida. It was devastating for them, and it really dismantled the Spanish mission system that had been built up over decades.
Wow, a heavy toll. Okay, let's shift north now. Our sources talk about Acadia and New England experiencing a petite guerre, a little war. What did that look like?
Yeah, petite guerre. It sounds almost minor, but it was incredibly brutal, often very personal. The core issue was French and Wabanaki resistance to New England expanding into Acadia.
Where did the French see Acadia's border?
From their perspective, it went down to the Kennebec River in southern Maine. So their strategy was basically to use raids, often with their Wabanaki allies, to create a kind of buffer zone to push back against English settlement.
And these raids were destructive.
Extremely. We have some really stark examples. In 1703, there was a series of attacks led by an Acadian officer, Beaubassin. They hit settlements all along the Maine coast, from Wells up to Falmouth, which is Portland now.
What happened?
They called it the Six Terrible Days. Over 300 settlers were killed or captured. Settlements along something like 45 miles of coast were just wiped out.
Good heavens.
And then there's maybe the most infamous one, the raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts in February 1704, led by Jean-Baptiste Hertel de Rouville.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's grim. About 50 villagers killed outright and 109 captured. That was something like 40% of the entire town's population.
40%.
And the march north to Canada afterwards in winter was incredibly harsh. Many captives didn't survive. Those who did face captivity, some were adopted into Mohawk families near Montreal. Ransom efforts took years for some.
That's terrifying. Were there other major raids like that?
Yes, the raiding continued. There were attacks on Groton, Massachusetts in 1707. Haverhill in 1708 was attacked and burned. Each one inflicted serious casualties and spread fear. These events really burned themselves into New England's memory.
I can only imagine. How did the New Englanders fight back against this?
They certainly tried. Major Benjamin Church, he was a famous figure from earlier wars, led raids against Acadian communities. Places like Grand Pre, Chignecto in the Minas Basin area in 1704 and other times.
Were those effective?
They definitely caused damage, disrupted things, but often the Acadians proved pretty resilient. They rebuilt. The bigger strategic goal for the English was capturing Port Royal, the capital of Acadia. They tried several times in 1707.
And failed.
Yeah, those attempts, especially the ones led by a commander named John March, were kind of fiascos. Bad leadership, logistical problems. They just couldn't take it.
But eventually they did get Port Royal, right? That was important.
Yes, that was a huge turning point in the North. Finally, in 1710, a bigger combined British and colonial force under Francis Nicholson managed to capture Port Royal after a siege.
And that was the end of French Acadia.
Well, the end of French control over the main peninsula part, yes. They renamed it Annapolis Royal. That area became British Nova Scotia. But, and this is important, Wabanaki resistance absolutely continued in the region even after the British took over Port Royal.
Okay, let's head even further north, Newfoundland. Why was that island important and what happened there?
Newfoundland was all about the fish. Immensely valuable fishing grounds. So control was fiercely contested between the English based mainly in St. John's and the French in Plaisance, now Placentia.
So more raiding.
Lots of raiding, yeah. Mostly focused on crippling each other's fishing operations and settlements. It was economically damaging warfare.
Did either side gain a major upper hand?
Well, the French actually scored a big victory in 1709. Led by Philip Constable and Joseph St. Ovid, they managed to capture St. John's itself.
How'd they manage that?
They used a combination of privateers, essentially legalized pirates, and their troops de la marine. They overwhelmed the defenses, destroyed fortifications, seized a lot of fishing boats.
That must have been a shock to the English.
Huge blow. But the French found they didn't really have the resources, the manpower to actually hold St. John's long term. So they ended up abandoning it later that same year.
Ah, so the English got it back.
Yes, they reoccupied it and started rebuilding the defenses. St. John's did have some decent defenses for the time, actually, Fort William, and they apparently had a big wooden boom they could stretch across the harbor entrance to block ships.
Right, okay. So constant back and forth there. Now let's talk about what sounds like a really dramatic moment, the failed Quebec expedition in 1711. What was the plan?
Oh, this was the big one. Hugely ambitious. The idea was a massive, coordinated, two-pronged assault to basically conquer all of New France.
Two prongs.
Yeah. One army, led by Francis Nicholson again, would march overland from New York towards Montreal via Lake Champlain.
Okay.
And the second, much larger force was a huge British naval fleet under Admiral Hovenden Walker. They were supposed to sail up the St. Lawrence River and capture Quebec City itself.
Sounds like a knockout blow attempt.
It was meant to be. Walker's fleet arrived in Boston in the summer of 1711, and just its presence put a massive strain on local supplies and resources there.
But it didn't work out. What went wrong?
Disaster struck when Walker's fleet tried to navigate the St. Lawrence in August. It's a notoriously tricky river currents, fog. Several of the big transport ships ran aground on rocks near a place called Elo of Egg Island. It was catastrophic. Over 700 soldiers drowned.
700. Just like that.
Just like that. A terrible loss of life.
So what did Walker do? What did this mean for the whole invasion?
Well, Walker was apparently devastated by the shipwrecks and also reportedly quite frustrated with difficulties he'd faced getting pilots and supplies in Boston. He made the call to just abandon the entire naval expedition and sail back to England.
Wow. And Nicholson marching on Montreal.
When Nicholson got word that the whole naval attack on Quebec was off, he had no choice but to turn his land army back as well. The whole grand strategy just collapsed.
Eclipse failure. How did the French react?
Well, in Quebec City, they saw it as practically a miracle, a divine deliverance. They actually renamed their main church, which they had previously called Notre Dame de la Victoire. After fighting off an earlier attack in 1690, they renamed it Notre Dame de Victoire, Our Lady of the Victories, plural.
Victories, plural. Wow. Okay, so after years of fighting this massive failed expedition, how did the war finally end in North America?
It wrapped up, along with the European War, with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713.
And what were the main terms of that treaty for North America?
There were some really significant territorial changes. France had to give up a lot to Great Britain. They ceded Acadia, which the British promptly renamed Nova Scotia.
Right.
They also ceded their claims to Newfoundland and the vast Hudson Bay territory. And down in the Caribbean, the island of St. Kitts.
So Britain gained a lot of ground. Did France keep anything?
Yes, they kept Cape Breton Island, which they called Ile Royale, and some other islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Crucially, they also kept specific fishing rights off parts of the Newfoundland coast. That was very important economically.
What about the indigenous nations? How are they factored in?
Well, the treaty did include a clause where France acknowledged British suzerainty over the Iroquois. But as we discussed, the reality of Iroquois allegiances and power was way more complex than that simple statement suggests.
Right. A European diplomatic term trying to simplify complex reality.
Exactly. And the treaty also said that trade with indigenous peoples in the interior should be open to traders from all European nations.
Okay, those are some major shifts on the map. What were the consequences of Utrecht, both immediate and longer term?
It really did reshape the whole picture in North America. While it brought peace to Europe for, well, over 30 years, here it basically kicked off that colonial Cold War we mentioned.
So not real peace here.
Not really lasting peace, no. More like a tense standoff. France, having lost Acadia and Newfoundland, really doubled down on its relationship with the Wabanaki Confederacy. They saw them as absolutely essential, a buffer against New England, pushing further north and east.
And that's when they built Louisbourg.
Exactly. They started constructing the massive fortress Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, Ile Royale, as this huge strategic stronghold to guard the entrance to the St. Lawrence and project French power.
What about the British? How did they handle their new territories, like Nova Scotia?
You know, their efforts to really control Nova Scotia right after the treaty were, well, a bit half-hearted, maybe. They established Annapolis Royal, but didn't flood the area with settlers immediately. This allowed continued resistance from the Acadians already living there and from the Micmac.
And what about New England? How did the war change things there?
The war definitely had a big impact. You could argue it accelerated this shift in New England society, moving away from the older, very religiously focused Puritan identity towards something more commercial, more integrated into the British Empire, a kind of Yankee identity taking shape.
Interesting. Now, going back to the indigenous peoples, you said Utrecht kind of ignored them.
That's a really critical point, and yeah, largely ignored their interests in sovereignty. The Wabanaki, who had fought alongside the French for years, weren't even at the negotiating table in Utrecht.
How did they react to that?
Understandably, with resentment and continued resistance. This failure to include them, to respect their claims, directly led to more conflict down the line, like Father Rail's War, sometimes called Lovewell's War, just a few years later, as they fought against British settlers moving onto their lands.
Was there any attempt at a treaty directly with the Wabanaki?
Yes, there was the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was ratified by some Wabanaki leaders in July 1713, after Utrecht. It was supposed to bring peace between them and the English colonies.
They did it.
Well, the treaty included promises from the English about respecting Wabanaki sovereignty, limiting settlement, regulating trade fairly, but those promises were very often broken by the English colonists and authorities.
So more fuel for the fire.
Absolutely. It just bred more distrust and tension, leading to more violence in the following decades.
So even with the main war over, the underlying problems didn't go away.
Not at all. France kept trying to limit English traders moving into the interior, connecting with more distant indigenous groups. French settlements kept growing along the Gulf Coast too, setting up future showdowns.
And in the South, you mentioned the Yamasee War.
Yes, the weakening of Spanish Florida after Queen Anne's War kind of created a power vacuum, which eventually led Britain to establish Georgia as a buffer colony. But the disruption and shifting alliances also contributed to widespread indigenous discontent, which boiled over into the Yamasee War starting in 1715, a major conflict in its own right.
What about the economic cost of Queen Anne's War itself?
It varied across the colonies. Some, especially in the South, took a big hit from trade disruptions and the cost of military campaigns. Others maybe less so, but it was definitely a costly war overall.
Okay, so wrapping this up. Queen Anne's War, clearly much more than just an echo of a European fight. It had massive lasting impacts here.
Absolutely. It redrew the map, establishing Great Britain as the dominant European power along the eastern seaboard. But it left so many issues simmering Indigenous rights, land claims, the ongoing rivalry between Britain and France, it really just set the stage for the next round of even bigger conflicts.
And we can't forget the human cost, right? Those raids we talked about, the captives, the huge impact on indigenous communities losing land, lives, autonomy. It was a brutal time.
Incredibly brutal. And thinking about something like the Treaty of Portsmouth, the promises made, the promises broken, it really highlights the tragedy and complexity of these colonial encounters, doesn't it? Imperial power came at a terrible cost, especially for the indigenous peoples.
It really makes you wonder, what if those treaties, those agreements had actually been honored? If indigenous perspectives had genuinely been considered, how different might North America look today?
That's a powerful question to leave with. A very different history, potentially.